Now that the Christmas season is over, it is time to jump back into our series of educational homilies. And this month, January, marks a full 2 years since I began this project. And back then, if you recall, I don't even know if I said, but I sort of calculated that getting through all of it would probably take about 3 years, and we're right on pace for that. So one more year to go. We last left off talking about the sacrament of the Eucharist, which was the conclusion of a longer series of homilies that I did on the three sacraments of initiation: baptism, confirmation, and the Eucharist. And so that means that we're ready to move on to the next group of sacraments, which are called the sacraments of healing. The first of the two sacraments of healing is the sacrament of reconciliation, also known as confession. And so we're going to be spending a bit of time on this one. The first thing, though, that we're going to talk about today is, in regard to confession, is the concept of sin itself. When we say the word sin, we can be talking about a number of things. So we're going to get some terminology down today and some sort of distinctions between different types of sin. And the first distinction is the difference between original sin and actual sin. Original sin is, the story that we're all familiar with. It is the sin of the first family, contracted by our first parents, Adam and Eve, who disobeyed God. And then, consequently, that sin is passed on to every human being who has ever lived, apart from, of course, Jesus and Mary. And as a result, we suffer from the results of original sin. Original sin puts us at odds with all of creation. It puts us at odds with God, because we've now lost the supernatural life with which we were originally created. Original sin puts us at odds with each other. It leads to mistrust and hatred and war. Original sin puts us at odds with the rest of creation. Animals fear us, diseases kill us, and natural disasters plague us. And finally, it puts us at odds with our very selves. Because of original sin, we age, we suffer, and we die. And finally, because of original sin, we suffer from something called concupiscence. Concupiscence is the sort of natural inclination or the natural draw that we have towards sin, towards selfishness. And it's that inclination that leads us to sin further. So, thanks, Adam and Eve. And that kind of brings up, the question, why do we have to suffer from something that they did? Why do we have to suffer from the consequences of their sin? How is that fair? They're the ones who sinned. Why do we have to deal with it? And generally, I give you 3 reasons. The first reason to not blame Adam and Eve is that somebody else would have eventually done the same thing, right? They would have committed the original sin, even if Adam and Eve managed not to. The second reason you really can't place blame on Adam and Eve for our current state is simply due to the fact that they're our first parents, and we inherit original sin and its effects pretty much like we inherit everything from our, immediate biological parents. Just like I owe my blue eyes and my big nose to my mom's side of the family, so too we owe our inclination to sin to our first parents. And finally, the third reason that we automatically inherit original sin from Adam and Eve is because sin never just affects the person that is doing the sinning. It affects everybody around that person. And it can be the most secret, most personal vice, but I guarantee that it affects the people around you, whether you know it or they know it or not. And that's because it affects you as a person on a fundamental level. You are not the person God intends you to be when we sin. And so you're not the person that God intends you to be toward other people. Just like the addict who thinks that they are only hurting themselves and not hurting other people. Well, they are. They're affecting the people around them. So too, if we think that our vices have no effect on other people, then we are gravely mistaken. And that has sort of a cascading effect down through the generations. If a parent was abusive, that's going to have an effect on the type of parent their child will be, so on and so forth. So that is original sin and why we inherit it. The next step is to distinguish original sin from what is called actual sin. And the word actual is focusing on the word act. It is an act. All sin is either original sin or actual sin. So here's the definition of sin. The actual sin. Actual sin is the voluntary transgression of the divine moral law, resulting in a turning away from God toward creatures in a disordered way. So we're going to break that down a bit. First of all, actual sin is a, quote, voluntary transgression. So that simply means that we choose to do it. It is voluntary. Second, actual sin is the voluntary transgression of the divine moral law. So this means that we go against God's law and what he has taught us. And then third, it is a voluntary transgression of the divine moral law, resulting in a turning away from God toward creatures in a disordered way. So this turning toward creatures means that we put something created before God. And that can be anything. It could be another person. It could be your own selfish desires. It can be an addiction. It can be work. Even your family can take you away from God in some cases. And that is, as the definition says, in a disordered way. So it is out of order. Our love should be of God first, and then of creation and those things that are created next. Based off this definition, you probably already figured out that most of the time when we use the word sin, we are in fact referring to actual sin. But we can go further with our distinctions. So there's original sin and there's actual sin. But then there's two types of actual sin, and that is mortal and venial sins. So mortal sin is called mortal because these are sins that lead to spiritual death. They cut us off from the life of God, and they lead to a loss of eternal life. And that results in an exclusion from the kingdom of God. So, in other words, a mortal sin is a choice to turn away from God. And getting back to the overarching topic that we'll be talking about for the next few weeks, mortal sins are what you confess when you go to confession. How do we know which sins are mortal? Well, there's three things to remember here. So for something to be a mortal sin, number one, the sin committed must be grave or serious. Well, how do we know if it's serious enough to count as a mortal sin? Well, pretty much you just take a look at the 10 commandments, and if you break one of those commandments, it's a serious sin. God only gave us 10. Everything else is not a serious sin. The second requirement for something to be a mortal sin is that you have to have full knowledge of the sinfulness of the act. So in other words, if you didn't know something was wrong, it isn't a mortal sin. Now, to be clear, sometimes we're ignorant of things that we should have known, but that's a separate sin of negligence. Also, even when we were, incorrectly or innocently unaware that something was sinful, it doesn't spare us from the effects of that mistake, right? You still suffer from them, regardless of how unaware of the harm that you were. The third requirement for a sin to be mortal is that you have to give complete consent. So the sinful act is committed freely and deliberately. And there's many situations where this might not actually be the case. If you do something out of fear, for example, that inhibits the likelihood that it was a choice freely made. If someone forces you to act in a way that you otherwise wouldn't, that's not a free choice. Even addiction can impair the ability for you to make a completely free choice, and so it can limit the seriousness of the sin. So to recap, you cannot commit a mortal sin if it isn't serious. You cannot commit a mortal sin, two, if you don't know the thing is wrong, but we should inform ourselves as best as we can. And number three, you cannot commit a mortal sin if you are coerced by somebody else. Venial sins are lesser sins which do not involve freely choosing, or they're not serious enough to lead to spiritual death. And that the word venial comes from the Latin word venia, which means to pardon or forgiveness. And basically, venial sins can simply be understood as a mortal sin that's missing one of those three elements. Either it wasn't serious, or you didn't know it was wrong, or you didn't freely choose to do it. And if that is the case, then the sin becomes venial. However, even though they're not as serious as mortal sins, they can be dangerous. And the reason is because when you repeat lesser sins, they can lead to a mortal sin, or they can lead to a bad habit. In the context of the broader discussion of the sacrament of confession, venial sins can be forgiven simply by receiving communion or praying the Our Father at Mass or simply asking God to forgive you. But you can choose to confess them in the sacrament of confession, especially I would recommend if they're habitual sins. But generally speaking, it's not required to confess venial sins in confession. So that is mortal and venial sins, the two types of actual sin. But guess what? We can break it down even further. So mortal and venial sins can each fall into two categories themselves. Sins of commission or sins of omission. So sins of commission are evil actions that you choose to do. You willingly commit those sins, hence the name sin of commission. Basically, you can think of these sins as our actions, the things that we do. And like I said, sins of commission can be either mortal or venial, and all the criteria that we've already gone through applies to that. You might be thinking, well, Father, aren't all sins based off of our actions? So doesn't that make every sin a sin of commission? And that's not quite true, because there is the other type of sin, sins of omission. And these are sins that are the result of our choice not to do something that we should have done. For example, refusing to help a person in danger or refusing to attend Mass. Those aren't actions, they're a choice not to do an action. And these are just as serious as the sinful actions that we do take. If we go to the Gospel, Matthew chapter 25 famously says this, "Then he will say to those on his left, 'Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. A stranger, and you gave me no welcome. Naked, and you gave me no clothing. Ill and in prison, and you did not care for me.'" So Jesus explicitly states that the things you don't do can equally end you up in hell as the things that you did do. That is the punishment. "Depart from me, you accursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." And so that's why we say in the prayer at the beginning of Mass, in what I have done and in what I have failed to do. Next, we have to talk about something that is not a sin in and of itself, but it's associated with sin. And this is something called occasion of sin, or occasions of sin. So occasions of sins are places, persons, or situations that will likely lead us to sin. And it's different for everybody, right? We all have our different inclinations and temptations. So when we prepare ourselves for confession, we have to also be thinking of those things. What are the conditions that usually lead me to this sin? And we all normally confess the same things. We're not inventing new ways to sin every time. And so we kind of know this about ourselves. What situations do I find myself getting into that cause me to sin? We have an obligation to think about these things, because that's the only way we'll ever be able to overcome those things. If you eliminate the opportunity, you'll likely eliminate the sin. That's one of the reasons, I gave up politics years ago, because I saw that it was making me unhappy and anxious and unpleasant to be around. And that's why I usually try to avoid small talk, because I know that it often leads to gossip. So on top of avoiding sin, we also have the obligation to avoid those occasions that lead us to sin. Now let's take all that I've just said and apply it to some very simple scenarios so that we can evaluate whether or not a sin of commission or omission is likely venial or mortal. So example number 1. You accidentally spilled coffee on the carpet in your boss's office. So that is, of course, a venial sin because it was an accident. He did not intend it, so it wasn't an act of free will. Once again, a reminder, though, that just because the sin is venial doesn't mean that it takes away the effects of the sin. Depending on your relationship with your boss, spilling coffee on your boss's carpet could have real-world consequences for your employment, whether or not you intended to commit a serious sin. Example number 2, you wanted to go to Mass on Sunday, but you couldn't because you had to stay home to care for your sick child. Same you could apply to situations of inclement weather. That would be another venial sin, especially in the case of caring for the sick. That's a legitimate, and I would say even selfless reason to miss Mass. Example number 3. You punched your brother in the face because he surprised you with a creepy mask and you're really scared. Okay, so this one is venial because you did it out of fear, and as a result, you didn't completely freely choose to punch your brother in the face. Now, this one is based off of a real story, and I'll give you one guess who the brother wearing the mask was. And unfortunately, I didn't think it through because when I was punched in the face, I was also standing on the top rung of a ladder. It was a hard landing, but it was hilarious nonetheless. So, example number 4, you really want to be the prom queen, so you spread rumors about the most popular girls in your class. Obviously, that is a mortal sin. You freely, and I'm guessing knowingly, made a bad choice to slander others, and that is against the 8th commandment. With all of this said, however, the bottom line is that there are only 2 people that can make the judgment of whether or not you have committed a mortal sin. And those 2 people are you and God. And that's because only you know what is truly in your heart and in your intentions. But you can ask a priest to help you to determine whether or not something was a serious sin. We do that all the time. I would be happy to answer your questions. And the last thing that I'll say to you today is to avoid something called scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is the feeling that everything we do is at least partially sinful in some way, that everything we do, we could have done better. It's the feeling that you're never going to do things well enough to God's standards. You feel like you could go to confession practically every day. And that thinking is spiritually crippling. It paints a rather hideous image of God that makes him out to be some sort of nanny that is pointing out all the things that we've done wrong. We need to avoid scrupulosity at all costs, because with that mindset, we will never meet the God who gave his life out of love for you. Instead, you will only see the sins that nailed him to the cross. And when we only see sins rather than love, that becomes a huge problem. So instead, perhaps give yourself a break. God loves you more than he hates sin. And I think that bears repeating. God loves you more than he hates sin.